So I think a great way to see the practical application of philosophy is to examine political philosophy, which, as the name on the tin would suggest, is basically finding those philosophical underpinnings to a lot of our political ideas. And of course, politics is concerned with the ways in which we organize and run our societies. Michael Sugrue said that politics is just ethics writ large, which I think is a pretty good way of understanding politics. And there are a lot of different ways that we have come up with ethical systems. These ethical systems tend to underlie broad political beliefs for how we ought to act to each other. And there are kind of different sections of ethics. We have meta-ethics, which is going to look at ethical frameworks like libertarianism or utilitarianism or deontological ethics, and is going to examine the grounding for those ethical claims. Do ethical propositions have a truth value? Can they be justified in an objective manner? Things like this. And then we have applied ethics, which is kind of going to deal with ethics, particular problems as they apply. For example, this might be like an ethics board for a law firm or for a hospital that is going to determine what's the best ethical decision in this case. And that's going to kind of take into account a lot of different ethical systems. Now, in political philosophy, there are kind of three broad ethical approaches we have, and these are rights-based ethics, ends-based ethics, and duty-based ethics. Rights-based ethics are, I think, best exemplified with the idea of libertarianism. And this is going to be the first political philosophy that I'm going to talk about in this Foundations of Political Philosophy and Ethics series. I'm going to do 3 episodes on this, one for each of the approaches, and this is coinciding with a class that I'm taking where we're kind of doing the class in a similar manner. Now, for rights-based ethics, obviously you can imagine it's going to be based around rights, whether that be human rights or rights more broadly. We can get into the discussion of to what extent do rights extend to certain domains or to certain subjects or things like this. And I think post-colonial studies has a lot to say about this, but we're just going to kind of take not a naive approach, but not a largely meta-ethical approach to give us a sense of, in my opinion, civic understanding, because this area of philosophy, political philosophy and ethics, I think is very important for all people to know. And I think, for example, when you go into university, you have to take certain prerequisites, and usually you'll have to take many that are kind of outside of your field or tangential to your field. I think ethics extends to all fields with a decent amount of applicability. So I think it's pretty important that we talk about ethics. And we're going to start with libertarianism. So libertarianism is quite ingrained in Western society, and especially the United States. It is derived from thinkers, most principally Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about what each of these thinkers think and how they derive rights and the importance of the state. Because there's several different underlying questions that libertarianism wants to deal with. First is where do rights come from. And the second being the role of the state. And the state being, you could literally think of states or state as a country. And we're going to start with question number 1 of where do rights come from? Now, Thomas Hobbes is very famous for saying that without the state, life would be brutish and short, or something to this extent. And Hobbes basically thought that if we wanted to understand ethics, the best way we need to do it is not in some abstract way, but we need to take an empirical look at what is human nature. And based on human nature, we can derive an ethical system that is best going to be able to encapsulate that human nature. So in a sense, it's almost like ethics has to have utility for the human race. That's something that utilitarians will play on a lot. But Hobbes says that in our natural state, our lives are defined by freedom and liberty. And the difference between those terms is basically non-existent. You can treat them as synonyms for basically all cases. But Hobbes says that in our natural state, meaning we are not ruled by a government, there's no laws of any kind, we're just like in a hunter-gatherer kind of state. We are free to do whatever we want. And we will do whatever we want to ensure our well-being and our survival. So we will steal, we will murder, we will cooperate, we will barter, we will trade, we will move around and do whatever it takes in order to maintain our survival. And for Hobbes, in man's natural state, the only thing that is wrong is killing yourself or doing anything against your best interest. There's kind of an implicit understanding in Hobbes that whatever is natural is right. And of course, we can talk about the problems with this, but I'm going to put that to the side and just take what Hobbes is saying at face value. So for Hobbes, in our natural state, these are the rules that we are bound by, and we are going to do whatever we can to ensure our survival. But as we come to interact with other people, there are certain things that can be gained from interacting with other people. Namely, we can take advantage of them. Now, at first you might think the thing that we could get from other people is cooperation. But of course, cooperation, think co, meaning together, and then operation, to operate. We are operating together. Now, for Hobbes, what would be even better than this is if you could take complete advantage of another person and subdue them. And this is what humans would do in their natural state. And this will become problematic when we build the state and we decide when should we respect laws and when is it advantageous for us to respect laws, because those two questions are very interconnected. But Hobbes will say that it is in our best interest not to cooperate, but to take advantage of other people. So if I'm engaged in some kind of trade with you, maybe it might be beneficial for me to lure you in with some sense of security and be like, oh, I'll pay you back later for an exchange, and then never pay them back. Or it might be within one's interest to ransack a city if you have the means to do so. And of course, we can see this playing out throughout, Chinese imperialism and just, French and British imperialism too. and colonialism too. And it's clear to see how Hobbes is probably pretty right about this. What is underlying our nature is selfishness. And this is kind of something that Richard Dawkins talks about in The Selfish Gene and the evolution of cooperation and stuff like this. Actually, it's just a hidden selfishness. So for Hobbes, there are benefits to forming larger groups, namely that there are more people for you to take advantage of. Now, Hobbes says this is all great, but the problem is it's not guaranteed to go one way. There is the possibility that the town that I ransack will later gain the ability to ransack my own town and kill me or put me into slavery or take advantage of me somehow. So Hobbes says that it is in our best interest to create some kind of contract. And this is kind of an important part in the process towards rights is in our natural state, it's violent and deadly. And this can serve our interests because if we develop small communities, we can take advantage of people. So an important part is that we are going to take advantage of people. But as we just said, this goes two ways. And we don't really like this because we can see how we would want to maximize longevity if we enter a group because this would maintain our survival. Now, if we want to maintain the longevity of the group, we need contracts. Now, as you can imagine, since we talked about the etymology of cooperation, contract, and we can imagine that this is an agreement made between two people. And the contract is going to require that certain things are given up. And if we think about our natural state of being able to do whatever we want to each other, and this being problematic because it can come back to bite us in the butt, a contract is going to serve to mitigate what the other person is allowed to do to us. But because it's between two people, it's also going to mean that we as individuals are going to have to be restrained in what we do. So our contract will go something like this. I won't infringe upon your rights. And Hobbes's idea is that you both sign it, and we've just made something great happen because we're still able to do almost everything that we want to do, provided that they don't infringe upon other people's rights. We've signed this contract, and I've agreed that while it may be in my best interests to take advantage of you, it's also in your best interests to take advantage of me. And in order to mitigate that risk, which of course is very risky if we're in a very primitive society where there are all kinds of wars and stuff happening, it is very advantageous to form a contract. Now, the problem is contracts are tenuous. What's to keep me when it comes time for me to be able to take advantage of you to go, no, I didn't sign that. What are you talking about? I'm going to take advantage of you. This is a piece of paper. What does it mean? And a contract doesn't have to be a piece of paper. I talked about in my last video on the social contract that there's this idea is that the social contract, which is what Hobbes is creating here, it's immaterial. It's kind of liminal, and it exists in this blank cultural space that we all agree to be in. Contracts are very tenuous, even if we write them out, because of a very important factor: enforcement. Enforcement is the backbone of Hobbes's idea of contracts, because enforcement makes it where if I erase my name from this contract, I'm going to incur a punishment. And because a punishment exists, that will mitigate me from working against my contract. And Hobbes says that this can be whatever one likes. He frames this around a God, that we'll have a God that's overarching us, that tells us you will not do this or you will go to hell, which of course kind of makes a very coercive situation. But the importance here is that coercion and enforcement is the backbone to society. Now, there are plenty of thinkers like Foucault who are going to talk about how bad of an idea that is. Nevertheless, it's the case that this is what Hobbes says. So enforcement is actually, we can see how it makes sense of all this. And now we could investigate the enforcer and say, well, what right do they have to enforce? But nevertheless, if there is some overarching authority, that's the term that Hobbes uses, is an overarching coercive authority, then they can enforce contracts and create a stable society that is going to keep our life from being brutish and short. And because of that, we have rights as a function of a social contract which we engage in with other people. And these rights are real, are tangible in proportion to their enforcement. And the less a right is being enforced, the less of a right it is at all. Because what right do you have to say it's a right if I can just, I can infringe upon it if I want to, and no one's going to tell me I can't? So there comes this particular dialectic, and this is featured a lot in modern thought, is to what extent should we respect the law? Because the question is, this contract can also be called the law, the contracts that we make. And of course, these laws don't always have to be corporeal things, but rather abstract concepts. Now the question is, what if a law is unjust? The idea is, of course, you shouldn't follow it. Now, here we can see the balance that has to be had with enforcement. If enforcement is too strong, the laws, if they're recognized as being unjust, people won't be able to contest this, and then they'll just destroy the enforcer. So there is a limit of state power, which is what this enforcement or this overarching coercive power represents. And for Hobbes, the limit of state enforcement is just ensuring that no one infringes upon people's basic human rights, which is the right, probably principally, is the right to one's person and to not be killed. So the right to one's life is probably the most important argument, or the most important right for Hobbes. And as such, the limit of state power is going to be, to what extent are they maintaining people's rights? And they are only being coercive insofar as they are able to maintain these rights. And if they step any further than that, then they're being overbearing, and then they are overbearing on our rights, which overbears on our natural state. So the state can inch as close as it wants to one's natural state in order to ensure it's maintained. But there is a strict wall between the state and nature, and the state is not supposed to infringe upon nature. So we can clearly see how Hobbes is making an appeal to nature for our ethical systems. Now, whether or not we should be making this appeal is another question, but nevertheless, this is kind of the basic Hobbesian libertarian idea. Now, the next important contribution to libertarianism is John Locke. John Locke's most important contribution for our study here is the idea of property rights, because the question might be, well, Hobbes has talked about these rights, and he's given us reason to assume at the very least that the right to life is a right, because to infringe upon that is to make it where people can't live in their natural state anymore. And the whole reason we made this contract was to ensure that we can't kill each other. But the question is, what other rights do we have? Now, both of these thinkers go through a lot of different rights that they will justify, but John Locke's most important one is property. And he starts out by laying the groundwork for personal property before going out into property rights to things around us. And Locke says, okay, I have a right to my person because no one else can be me for me. This is kind of something that Heidegger talks about, but no one else can do the job of exercising my agency. I have a right to do whatever I want with my person in my natural state. And in a similar appeal to nature, Locke says that I have a right to my personal property. And if someone goes to infringe upon this property, namely my person, that is immoral. And we can see the underlying idea in Locke is that reason is going to give us ethics. Because Locke says, if this is my state in nature, reason tells me that whatever is natural in my natural state is something I have a right to. And we might have to adjust these rights a little bit, namely, for example, my right to kill you. We might have to take that back a little bit such that we can actually form a stable society and give us better, happier lives. But nevertheless, reason is our guiding principle. So there's a little bit of a step back from the appeal to nature towards the appeal to reason, but it's still an indirect appeal to nature. So Locke says, I have my rights to my personal autonomy and to do whatever I want with my person, and for someone to infringe upon my right to do whatever I want, in the same way that Hobbes would say, is wrong. So anything you can think of that is going to infringe upon my right to do whatever I want with my body, if someone comes in and puts my arms behind my back and handcuffs me without warrant, this is, of course, a violation of my right to bodily autonomy, which neither Locke nor Hobbes are using bodily autonomy. That's a modern term, but I think it best encapsulates what exactly they're trying to say. So obviously, if someone does that without warrant, they shouldn't be able to do that. And of course, without warrant, there are situations where we can imagine, okay, if I've done a crime and I need to be restrained, then this makes sense. Putting my arms behind my back and putting me into a car and shipping me off to some dark, cold room might seem like it doesn't make sense, but of course the idea is if someone has committed a crime, then they have lost some of their ability to exercise their rights because they have infringed upon someone else's rights. So the idea, of course, is that this contract is reciprocal. And if I invade too much on the contract and do something that's going to inhibit someone else's rights, it's justified to come back at me and infringe upon my own rights. And this is kind of something where some libertarians would make the argument for like the death penalty or something, that if I kill someone else, now they have the right to kill me. And we could talk all about that. I think that's a very interesting ethical concern to have about, does death, is it something that we can exercise on other people? Hobbes would probably say no, but I'm not sure. Locke definitely says in some cases, he talks about the death penalty in his second treatise of government, that there are certain situations where the death penalty is permissible because someone has overstepped their contract. But nevertheless, Locke says that we have rights to our own body. Now, how is it that we have rights to other things? Locke frames this in a theological way, but we can dissect it a little bit and make it secularized. But Locke says God has given everything to everyone in common. He gave Adam the whole Garden of Eden, and he could eat of whatever he chose, and he gave this world to mankind. And the idea is, because of that, what right do we have to obtain property? Because we're essentially hoarding it and taking it from someone. And in a sense, we could see that maybe this is infringing upon their rights, perhaps. Locke says, no. I have personal property rights because my agency is mine. And whenever I locomote my body or do anything, I have a right to what I'm appropriating, namely my body. So Locke says, when I go into nature, I may find, for example, a tree. A tree. I'm using blue because my green marker is out. And it has fruits on it. And Locke says, in my natural state, I can go and pick one of these fruits off. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm free to do whatever I want. And Locke says that I also have the right to eat it if I want to, because this has been provided for my nourishment. So at some point, this thing becomes mine, or at least we would say it becomes mine if, for example, I cut down a tree and make a house. Sure, it's yours now, but why? And when does it become yours? Locke says, whenever you put your energy into something such that you appropriate it for your own use, it is your property. So Locke says that the point at which I take this fruit and I take it off the tree and I eat it, it is now mine because I have infused my labor with nature. So my labor, the things I do, are mine because they're an extension of my agency. So whenever I do anything and appropriate anything in nature for my use, it is mine now. So this is Locke's argument for personal property, not only personal as in my person, but personal property as in objects around me that I can own and trade and things like that. So one may think of this and go to monetary terms and say, okay, I have some dollar bills here and I want to accumulate a ton of money, because we can say that money, it has value that stands in for some kind of commodity, for something like a fruit or a saddle or a horse or something like this. So if I want to accumulate a lot of money, and I think it's important to contextualize a situation like this in the modern world, what's to stop me from just accumulating as much money as I want? this might strike you as something important or something not important. Because the question is, okay, I'm a king and I am a overarching coercive authority in the Hobbesian sense. I can take advantage of my citizens and do whatever I want. Now, one might say, no, that's wrong according to the social contract. But Hobbes says, I have the ability to do it, so why not? Now, of course, if I've formed a contract, the idea is if I have the power to break that contract, then there's nothing wrong with breaking the contract. Because who's to tell me in my natural state what I'm doing is wrong? I'm just doing what's good for me, and you're going to do what's good for you. What's the problem? Locke makes us have a little pause here. He says, and this doesn't necessarily work for money, but at least for Locke's argument, but he says, okay, if I'm picking off this tree and I pick an apple, I am picking it because I'm going to use it and I'm going to make something with it. Maybe I make a pie, or maybe I just eat the apple, or maybe I turn it into a charitable donation or something like this. There's no problem with this, and we wouldn't say there is any problem with this in this abstract situation. But what do I do if I want to take the tree and I want to just dig a big hole and I want to put all the fruits in this hole? I want to take all the fruits from this tree and I just want to put them in a hole and let them stay there. Is there something wrong with this? Locke says, yeah, there is a problem with this. You can't eat all those apples before they're going to spoil. And because they've spoiled, you've wasted nature. And in a sense, you've defiled nature. And this isn't some sort of like, oh, it's just wrong to defile nature. But he says that by doing this to nature and engaging in spoilage, you have infringed upon other people's rights to have the food they need to survive. So in a sense, taking from nature is always impeding to some extent on another person's ability to survive. But in most cases, say I take one fruit, it's so benign it doesn't really matter. But if I want to appropriate 1,000 fruits and put them in a hole and just let them sit there and don't do anything with it, if there's 1,000 fruits in the whole village, I've deprived an entire village of their right to appropriate things for their survival, and thus I have infringed upon someone else's rights. So this is why libertarianism is rights-based, because the rightness or wrongness of an action depends on, is it infringing upon other people's rights? Now, some might say this would be a very extreme libertarian view, but that taking anything out of nature is always ensuring that now this can't go to anyone else. So now I've infringed upon someone else's rights. Now we can see there's a little bit of a calculus that has to go on here with how much is too much, or when am I infringing upon someone else's rights. But within a rights-based perspective, we can at least see the broad picture, which is that the thing that is going to resist our right to accumulate whatever we want is spoilage. Now, we can see how this particular argument about fruit doesn't necessarily translate to money in the strictest sense, because it's paper. It's not going to rot like an apple is, but it is going to inflate over time and lose its value. So maybe we could make some argument like that. Now, it's important when we talk about rights-based ethics, which is epitomized in libertarianism, which I haven't really talked a lot about in terms of this word, but we can basically understand it to have a number of presumptions. First, you have the right to do whatever you want up until the point in which you infringe upon someone else's right to do whatever they want. And if you do infringe upon someone else's rights, we can only see this as ethically permissible if it goes both ways. If it's a double barrier that, if this is the whole range of possible actions for two people, and we can do whatever we want here, and let's say this side is benign actions and these ones are extreme. We might say, okay, let's put a line right here, all the way at the end. We'll say, okay, person A here is going to say, person B, you can do basically everything you want, but the only thing I would like you not to do is kill me. And that's this little sliver. And person B might say, you know what, that's really great, because person A, I don't want you to kill me either. So it's in our best interests to form a contract such that this area is off limits to both of us. Now, as Hobbes says, there's someone who needs to enforce the contract, because otherwise, what's to say that person A and person B get into a situation where person B has the option to do something in this realm? He might have the contract in the back of his head of person A saying, please don't kill me. But if it's going to maintain person B's survival, and they can, what's to say he's not going to utilize this area? And the obvious response is, if he is punished, if doing something in this area entails that he has some punishment that is severe enough that he's not going to want to do that, then he won't do it. Now, I've talked that this is a very kind of coercive setup, that we should just use fear tactics to tell us what we should or shouldn't do. Some may say some things are just right, some things are just wrong, or we should determine what's right or wrong based on overall human well-being. This is a utilitarian kind of idea. But the libertarian idea is that this, at the very least, is something we agree to in the social contract, which is this kind of amorphous contract that we make in a society where we say we're not going to do such and such things because it's in all of our best interests mutually between each other to form this contract. And the important thing is it's between each other. For person A and person B's uses, it's best that neither of them infringe upon this situation. And we can imagine this on a sliding scale of where this line is supposed to go. And the question may be, what kind of infringement upon our rights should we be mutually engaging in? We want to be as free as possible. We want this line to be as far to the right as possible, and we have to not do the least amount of things possible, so we're able to do the most and make use of freedom. And of course, if you live in the US, this is a huge talking point, freedom. And I think it should be, but nevertheless, this is what libertarianism is. It's got liber, which comes from libertas in Latin, freedom, in the name. So it should be pretty clear pretty instantly what libertarianism is about. It's about freedom and maximizing freedom. And there's a cutoff point, but nevertheless, it's about maximizing human freedom and ensuring that we can do as much as we want, provided that other people don't interfere with us being able to do whatever we want. And this necessitates, in order for this mutual interaction to be able to be maintained, it requires the intervention of the state. And not just any state, but a big state. Big enough, I should say, that it's going to maintain this without, by its intervention, moving this line this way. Because as we can imagine, what kind of limitations is the state going to use to ensure that freedom is maintained, but also that people's lives are maintained, so that there is a certain minimal amount of prohibition? What sort of things does the state have at its disposal? Police is probably the biggest one I think about. The police are going to punish you and ensure that if you try to cross this boundary, there is going to be a punishment that is sort of an equal and opposite reaction. That's going to make sure that you infringing upon this space to another is paramount to you imposing on that space to yourself. The state, ideally in a libertarian scenario, if you infringe upon a right, the state is going to infringe upon that right on you and ensure a balance happens. But the police is not the only thing we have. We also have schools, because schools are going to ensure there is a tacit realization of where this line lies. Because the question is, if the social contract is not something real, if in the sense of a piece of paper, and it's not something everyone signs when they're born, it's something implicit. And the question is, different people have different ideas about where this line should be. If you're involved with politics in any way, this question of interference or regulation, people have different ideas about where that regulatory line should be. And schools can ensure that this is maintained. But an important one is laws. This is a big one. The laws of the state are going to take this space here and codify it into something present. Because, in a primitive kind of situation where we're just making these implicit agreements of each time I come up to someone, I go, okay, first, before we do anything, don't kill me, okay? And you don't kill me? Good? That could get boring after a long time, and it's not very efficient. Now, what if we had something every time we went into this situation that was telling us this without us having to communicate it? This is the idea of laws, or specifically natural law. Or this would be, in a theological realm, that God-given morality. What God gives you and tells you in your brain that you all just don't have to talk about without knowing, okay, I'm not going to infringe upon this. The state serves as another way to add this in. They take laws that people vote on democratically and they say, okay, people have democratically voted and thus they have kind of agreed as a majority of the society that this should be the case and this is where this line should be. And as such, we're going to codify it into the laws so that it's clear for everyone to see, like Big Brother in George Orwell's 1984, that every time we go into this situation, it's going to be very clear. You know what you're not supposed to do and you know what you're allowed to do. And what you're allowed to do in a libertarian situation should be quite a lot. And what you're not allowed to do should be as little as possible. Because you want it to be big enough that it's not going to bite you in the butt. So it's a large question of what one is comfortable with. And this is the importance of democracy in a libertarian system, and not just in a libertarian system. But you want it to be wide enough, but not too wide, narrow, but not too narrow. So it's very much a balancing game. And we could do this philosophically through what rights do we have and what does that entail we can't do. And we could also just do that kind of implicitly through voting and stuff like this. And this is the importance of voting, everyone, which I say that and I realize that each singular vote has very little power. It's a collective point at which it has any power. But laws is probably the most important idea, because in a sense, the laws are not a contract made between individual B and the state and individual A and the state. The laws are a contract made between two people, which is then codified by the state or made manifest by the state. Because an individual cannot make a contract with the state because the state is not a thing. It's not a thing because it's not independent of the people who make it up. This is kind of the idea of e pluribus unum, out of many one, the motto of the United States. The out of many people forms one thing which we call the United States, and we codify into something corporeal through the government or the state and its laws and its policing and its schools and its various programs. So the laws are not some thing made outside of the consent of the people, but rather is just a manifestation of what people have already agreed to. Now the question is, what people are you choosing to be allowed to vote? Because if it's too restrictive, then these laws are just a manifestation of part of what society has agreed to. But nevertheless, this is the underlying idea. So we get kind of a rough sketch of how the libertarian calculus goes. That's what I call this, is the libertarian calculus of how we should decide whether an action is right or wrong. Where does this line go on our sliding scale such that this is as big as possible, that freedom is as big as possible? And how do we enforce that such that the line means anything at all? Now, an important part of ethics is practice. Ethics is about how do we justify our actions, or kind of put plainly, what's the right thing to do, which is the subtitle of, for example, Michael Sandel's book on ethics, which we're reading for the class. And I definitely recommend you read it because it's a very nice overview of this thing. But in ethics, it's all about practical application. So if you don't think that philosophy has a practical application, then check out ethics before you say that. And what kind of ethics are you talking about? Because some people might say meta-ethics has no practical application. I think it's a question about the directness of the application, but nevertheless, it's important to contextualize these kind of stuff we've said with some examples. So today, an important discussion is social welfare. Now, this means two things. Firstly, it is the welfare of the people, the well-being of the people. And I think this shows how most people aren't just straight libertarian or straight utilitarian or straight deontological ethics. There's kind of a mix of all of them. But when we see people suffering, we want to do what we can to help them. And there are various systems, maybe you feel obliged to help people because of a religious devotion or because of some just personal ethic inside that you just feel like this is right. So nevertheless, the question of social welfare comes into being. And this should be made obvious when we were talking about accumulation of money. For Locke, the only thing that's wrong with accumulating as much as you want is if it spoils. So if it spoils, then there's something wrong with it. But if it doesn't spoil, there's nothing wrong with it. So it's clear, and if you are familiar with libertarian rhetoric at all, an important part of libertarianism is the free market. That there's nothing immoral about the free market, because a lot of people today, myself included, would look at free market capitalism and would say it leads to disenfranchisement of certain people. And it makes it where even if they put their best foot forward, they're at a disadvantage or something like this. And it allows for the accumulation of wealth in a small amount of people. Now, libertarians would say there's nothing wrong with the free market because there's nothing moral about that. Not to say that it's immoral, but there's no moral consideration that goes into the free market just doing its thing. The free market is just operating according to supply and demand, and it's not infringing upon people's rights to freely engage in a market. And of course the question is, are we freely engaging in a market? To what extent is coercion butt up against freedom in the modern world? But they would say there's nothing wrong with the free market just doing its thing. So if the free market leads to the mass disenfranchisement of millions of people, so be it. Because it's people doing what they can to fend for themselves, and provided other people are in this free market too, well, they're just not working hard enough, or whatever it may be. They would say that the free market is fine as it is. And in terms of social welfare, there are many people who say that when social welfare is down, we should funnel in money to people who need it. So if there's two spheres and one has lots of money and one has a little bit of money, the idea with social welfare is, well, we want to provide for people's social welfare, so we should take it out of the hands of the people who don't need it as much, and we should give it to the people who need it, such that it's a little bit more equal. Now, the libertarian would say that this is a grave mistake. Not only have we redistributed wealth, which it's so abstract, it's like, is that even a moral thing or an immoral thing? They would say we have stolen from the person with more money. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but the libertarian would say that any social welfare program that is going to take money from one person and give it to another is theft, just straight up theft. So the free market doing its thing is fine because we're all engaged in a contract where we're doing this thing, and some people make it out on top and some people don't. But in the case of social welfare, some people not having as much money as others does not give us the right to steal from other people. They would say, this is the kind of two wrongs don't make a right kind of thing. That just because this person's suffering doesn't give them the right to make someone else suffer in order to make them not suffer, because then we're infringing upon their rights to freely do with their money as they please. So in terms of social welfare, libertarians are generally going to be opposed to social welfare programs that are going to entail taking money from some people and giving it to others. So if you're kind of, where am I politically, or what exactly is libertarianism, and do I agree with it because I hear about it so much, there's some food for thought. And I think another thing that is very tangentially related to this is taxes. The libertarian would say that in most cases, taxation is theft. In this sense, we can see how libertarianism shares a little bit with anarchism. Anarchists generally would see the state as an infringement of our rights. and in a sense, anarchism is kind of an extreme form of libertarianism. But don't let that get you in a fuss, because I know anarchism has so much more of a negative connotation than libertarianism does. But libertarians would say that taxation is theft if it goes beyond a very small point. They would say, if I have a situation where I've got two circles, which are representative of people, and I've got lots of money, and this circle over here is the construction of a new road. Here's the dotted line. This road is beneficial for me, and it is going to ensure that I live a better life. And I might not be able to make this road on my own. So it might be beneficial for taxes to take some of my money, funnel it into building a road, because that is going to come back to me. Now, the shape that we've just made is very important. It's circular. And this is an important part of libertarianism, is that taking away rights only works if it's going to be reimbursed, or if it's going to ensure that it is made up for in kind of the grand scheme of things. So taxes only work if they take the same amount of money here, put in the same amount of money here, and give me back the same amount of utility that that money had that I gave up. So if they took away, let's say, $100, whatever utility the thing they put that $100 into, if it comes back to me as $100 worth of value, which that might be a little abstract to actually determine what that value is, but we can think of this in abstract. If $100 is coming back to me, well, it's not theft. It's just me investing my money into the state, which is going to be able to invest it into something that I might not have been able to do, which is going to come back to me, which is going to allow me to invest again, and it's just a big circle. So, in some sense, libertarians would see very limited taxes as a form of philanthropy, or as a form of free market capitalism, where I'm freely giving up my money. And you might say, oh, it's tax day, I've got to pay my taxes, but I know it's going to help to build schools and do all this stuff, which is going to come back to me. I don't want to give up my money, but it's just a little bit of money, so it's justifiable. This is kind of the, you know, because no one likes to pay taxes, strictly speaking. But the libertarian would say, okay, if these taxes are going to come back to me, then they're justified. Now the problem is, if they take away $100, which is essentially they would say that they're taking this away, but I'm willingly engaging and letting them take this money away because it comes back to me. If I give them $100 and they give me back $80, someone might say, oh my gosh, they have just stolen from me. Now, it depends on the situation. There's still a libertarian argument for saying that this is okay. Because the question is, what happens to that $20? If that $20 goes into the state, this could be good or bad. The state has to pay a certain amount for its employees and things like that. It has certain economic needs. So the libertarian might say, okay, this is a reasonable amount because it's going into the state, which is what the tax is kind of representing. And they're going to use that to help build roads and stuff, and this is going to come back to me. So in a sense, even though I've got a little bit less money back, this $20 is going into a larger social support net that is going to allow me to live a happier life, such that I've basically invested $20 into my well-being that's not directly coming back to me as money, but rather that $20 is being transformed into pure social welfare in the sense that it is making me more well off. But if it goes to, I don't know, if this $20 goes to a homeless shelter, as extreme as this might sound, the Libertarian would say that this is theft. Now, why is it theft? It's going into some good cause, because I didn't give up that money to the homeless shelter. The government made me use my money to invest in the homeless shelter, essentially, through this $20. So we can see that the state has to be coercive insofar as it's an overarching coercive power that can maintain contracts, but it can't be too coercive or it's criminal and it's theft. So there's kind of a fine line with libertarians of we want not a lot of government control, but we want enough where we can maintain our rights. And that is the only function that the state should serve for me, is to ensure I can live my best life and others can live their best life only because it allows me to continue living my best life. So this is theft. The only way that putting money into a homeless shelter is not theft is if I willingly take my money out and I put it into the homeless shelter without them making me do it by taking taxes away from me. So in a sense, we can see kind of the idea of libertarian tax policy. This one's going to get me in some hot water. Okay, so abortion. Some people might be surprised by the libertarian response to abortion. And it's difficult to give categorical responses, but I'm just going to kind of speak in abstract to give you a general idea. Generally, the libertarian response to abortion is going to be to leave it up to freedom. Because, of course, any ethical decision is only going to be ethical if it allows me to exercise my freedom without coming back to bite me in the butt. If it comes back and bites me in the butt, then we have a problem. But if I'm able to freely make a choice, this is the ideal situation. So ideally, the libertarian would say that it is up to the individual person whether or not abortion is right for their situation. And of course, now we get into a larger discussion of, is this a life, and are we thus interfering with someone's right to life? And there are kind of two positions on this. There is the libertarian who says, I know definitively this is a right or not, or this is a life or not, and let's say we have two boxes. We have life and not life. This baby that's being aborted is either alive or it's not. What happens if the libertarian says this is alive? Now, if that is the case, then to abort the baby would be wrong, because according to the very basic Hobbesian notion, we are interfering with the rights of someone who deserves to have their rights protected. But what do I do if I determine it's not a life? Then, of course, obviously there's no problem with this. The problem that makes so many people say that abortion is wrong is they say it's murder, we're killing something. So if it is a life, this decision is critically important, and if it's not, it's extremely benign and really doesn't amount to much at all. Now, the problem is, what do we do if we can't agree here and we just are going back and forth and no one can decide whether it's a life or not? The alternative response would be, you've got the one libertarian who's going to make a stance either way and say, because of that stance, that's going to determine if abortion is allowed or not. And that we can make a state policy that says no one is allowed to abort, or everyone is allowed to abort if they wish. The alternative libertarian response is that because this is unsure, we should always resort back to freedom and give people the free choice to decide whether or not it's a life or not, and whether or not it's a decision that fits their situation and something that they want to engage in. So we can envision two libertarian responses, and really I wouldn't be able to tell you one way or the other, because the Libertarian Party in the US, in some ways it's a lot of conservatives who aren't actually libertarians but kind of are, and in some ways it is genuine libertarians, because libertarians would say freedom is always the thing, and if we have like an ethically charged situation like abortion and it's a little bit unclear, it should always be left up to the free individual to make that decision. But not all people who call themselves a libertarian or are in the Libertarian Party might say that. Some of them might say, I know that it's a life and as such no one should be able to do it. And someone might reproach them and say, well, you're not being a true libertarian then, because now you're not giving people the free choice to decide. And they might rebut and say, well, you're interfering with someone's life, so you don't get the choice anymore, because now this is part of those actions that we bar as a society who have signed the social contract. So we can see there is some leeway within the libertarian logic. But I just thought it might be nice to explain a little bit about what libertarianism is, what are its underlying assumptions, and how does its calculus work in order to determine if an action is right or not, and how does it apply to real life. So this is rights-based ethics in a nutshell. There's more to talk about and there's more nuance, and I think it's really interesting to get into how there are different responses within the same system. But nevertheless, this is some kind of, hopefully some important food for thought, and gives you some reasons to say I'm a libertarian, or I'm not, or I'm somewhere in the middle, because most people are in the middle. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in another lecture.